Greetings and blessings, YouTube. This is John the Jansenist, and this is the second part of my response to a user that had some questions regarding Christianity and, in particular, doctrine and orthodoxy. Now, towards the middle of the first paragraph in your message, you made a statement that I wanted to address specifically. But if doctrine espouses a certain view of God, yet we are to pursue him as a personal, individual relationship, then what to do with an orthodoxy? Now, the thing to understand here is that although we come into an individual relationship with God, there is also the question of full communion of all believers. That's something that's also discussed in the Bible. Essentially, there is a sense of conformity that needs to occur both within the institutional church itself, which is an offshoot of God's revelation and a necessary one also in order to maintain doctrinal practice, and there is also the issue of one's individual relationship with God. Essentially, all of these things need to be brought into a compatible conformity, and we need to distinguish between conformity and uniformity. They're not necessarily the same thing. One denotes an agreement pertaining to certain specific issues. That's what conformity would be, versus uniformity, in which everyone is exactly the same. Thus, there are certain standards, for instance, let's say public school attire. There are certain standards of decency that are established within the public school, a certain way that you're recommended to dress. A lot of people in various school districts tend to dislike the idea of people showing up scantily dressed, as it were. But that does not necessarily imply that we all need to be dressed exactly the same. Thus, we don't all necessarily need to be in uniforms the way most Catholic schools tend to require people to dress. And getting into specifically to an entire religious community, we are expected to come into a certain conformity within terms to how we dress at church, for example, just to use an analogy, but we don't necessarily have to be like the Amish, and we have to have a specific attire that we wear all day, every day, in order to be good believers. That's not necessarily what's being required of us, and that's where orthodoxy comes in. Orthodoxy specifically establishes the rule of faith, and the rule of faith is what essentially governs the entire religion. And the rule of faith is brought out of Scripture, but at the same time it is also a necessary component in Scripture's continual teaching and understanding. Now, one might ask, well, this brings into the issue the whole chicken and the egg scenario. I mean, which comes first here? And the answer to that is that the first thing that comes into play is God's grace, as it were, and from grace we come to understanding, and from understanding we come to faith, as it were. One of the greatest misunderstandings about the Bible that most Christians seem to have today is that you need to practice faith in order to be a Christian, and that's the beginning of being a Christian. That is actually not the beginning. If you read the Bible specifically, there has to be something granted of you, and this gets into John chapter 6, verse 44, no man may come to me unless my Father draw him. What that means is that before somebody comes to saving faith, there is a process which is solely monergistic. In other words, it is entirely the process by which God works. We don't have anything to do in that because we are treated in the Bible, I don't remember the exact verse, but I will post it on the screen, that we are dead in sin and thus we need to be regenerated, or the actual term of the Bible is born again. What this states is that because we are dead, we need to be resurrected in order to come to belief. And this speaks specifically to a spiritual death that makes it impossible for us to believe that which is presented to us. The process begins with the doctrine of justification, and this is something that's shared between all Augustinian thinkers, Catholic and Protestant alike. And this is basically where we are essentially found not guilty by God. And unlike a criminal proceeding where this is based entirely on the facts of the case, In this particular case, the grace that is granted, by which we obtain justification, is wholly gratuitous. It is done entirely for God's good pleasure. Thus, it is by God's election that we are justified. And once we are justified and we are found not guilty, we are then adopted into God's family, hence the term children of God. And it is from there that we are granted certain privileges by which we can practice good saving faith, and we can also achieve good works, both of faith and beyond faith. And the process by which this occurs is called sanctification. And I am going to put up some verses at the end of this video that deal specifically with all three of those doctrines. Now, the thing that comes into play here is the issue of predestination, and in my case, being a Jansenist, I observe the doctrine of double predestination, which states that from the beginning, from eternity, a decree was set forth that defined the entire parameters of creation. Unlike certain people out there, I think there's a user on here named TrustinJC, who asserts that God's foreknowledge is how he knows who is going to be saved and who is not. I assert that God has foreknowledge because he has decreed everything. He has decreed the nature of all existence within nature, and as such, he automatically knows by matter of necessity how we are going to behave, what choices we are going to make. Now, this brings up a broader question of determinism versus free will. Are we indeed free beings acting freely, or are we mechanistic automatons that are simply doing nothing but acting out existing programs? The assertion of the Bible and the assertion that I hold to as a Jansenist is that there is a compatibilistic relationship between the will of man and the will of God. Whatever God intends, that is attributed to man's nature, and man is not being compulsed into making right or wrong choices. He is simply making choices based on his nature. For instance, there are certain choices that I make by necessity. I have to drink water in order to survive. I have to consume. I have to be clothed to protect myself from the elements, stuff like that. Those are matters of necessity, but they are things that I could essentially choose when I would do them and how I would do them. I don't necessarily have to just dress myself in a loincloth, for example. I can dress in a tuxedo, for instance. But the thing is that regardless what our choices are, by necessity of our nature, we are going to choose certain things, and those things are by which we come into condemnation. And this gets into the doctrine of original sin, which I am pretty well sure that no Pentecostal denomination believes in. So that's where the gulf would probably exist between your understanding of Christianity and mine. Now, all of this is something that it probably comes off as a pretty bleak outlook on life, and it might shed some light as to why I'm as into metal as I am, given that I'm a confessing Christian. But essentially, the Bible treats all of man as being condemned, and all that come to salvation come primarily because they have already been drawn. They have been spiritually resurrected, and they've been given the ability to make right choices. It does not necessarily mean that they will always make right choices. That's something that also is discussed in Scripture as well, and it has to deal specifically with the topic of indwelling sin, dying in a person but still existing upon regeneration, and sin reigning in a person. And the difference ultimately between someone who is regenerated and practicing saving faith is that even though they will come to sin from time to time, that sin is being fought against. There is a struggle going on between the believer and the sin itself, whereas in the case of the unbeliever, there is no conflict because the fallen nature of that individual is in perfect concurrence with the bondage of sin. He does these things because he wants to. We all as human beings do things because we want to, and we can only want for different things if our nature changes. And the Bible specifically grants God that singular prerogative of whose nature he's going to change. Now, there is an assertion that comes out of this, well, God has to be necessarily either a psychopath or a tyrant in order to take this approach. And the only way to really respond to that is simply to state the following. When a person living, a human being, is committing an act, they are always subject to a higher moral standard on something. There's always something that they are subjected underneath. The most basic thing to consider when dealing specifically with God's election, with God's prerogative, with God's good pleasure, and the gratuitous way that he attributes grace to those whom he elects, is what standard specifically do we measure God against? If we accept de facto God's existence and all of the nature that is attributed to him, what standard are we going to measure against him? Now, the truth is that when we deal with something that has complete and utter sovereignty over its entire creation, there is no standard to judge him against. He essentially is the standard because he is the source of all standards, the source of all existence. So at the end of the day, the place to go in order to understand the nature of God is the book of Job, and particularly the closing chapters. And this is where essentially the men are separated from the boys, for lack of a better term, and true Christianity is separated from false Christianity. A person that can wholly and fully submit himself to the fact that his salvation, his spiritual resurrection, is entirely the prerogative of something alien of himself, something that's outside of him and outside of his control. That is an assertion of real Orthodox Christianity. And that's something that's shared between several current denominations, albeit they are small in number. But the vast majority of people confessing to be Christians today would argue along the same lines that an atheist would argue on this topic, which is that that doesn't strike me as a loving God, a God that would knowingly condemn a number of people to hell simply because he chose not to visit his grace upon them. And that is probably an answer that probably wouldn't sit well with you either, but that's essentially the answer that Scripture gives, and that is the answer that I've come to accept. Now, does this mean that I stand in judgment of everyone I meet? Obviously not. The Bible also says, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." Now, that phrase in and of itself naturally has a number of different meanings depending on the context, but specifically within the context of where that verse is cited, it deals specifically with not holding others to standards that you yourself cannot measure up to. Man is by nature hypocritical. That is entirely a consequence of the fall as denoted in the book of Genesis. And so people are going to judge, and they're going to judge wrongly, and they are going to commit acts, and they are going to commit these acts wrongly. So this happens as a matter of necessity. So again, whether or not we succeed in coming to a saving faith is entirely on our ability to be excused from that which we do by necessity. And that's pretty much how I would respond to the questions that you've sent within the case of, I think later on, where you got into the issue of the rebuttal. I don't know if I covered this earlier or not. I've been kind of flying by the seat of my pants here. Is that Christ had to be different to the Gentiles, but you essentially talk about how the Old Testament and the New Testament tend to not be in unity with each other. Those two collections of history denote two specifically different times, and God's will essentially unfolds through time. Before Christ's birth, everything that would pertain to salvation is observed in worship through types and shadows. Ergo, they're pointing towards the point of Christ's birth, but it's not there yet, so it appears differently. It is a time in which sin has greater reign upon the earth, and then at Christ's sacrifice, he destroys the reign of sin upon those whom are the elect of God, and thus the image is not as bleak because the atonement has been achieved, essentially. So, until next time, in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, God be with you.